Over the course of my diving career here on the Mendocino coast, I've seen a great up and a great down, especially with the kelp forests. I was born and raised here on the Mendocino coast, and I'm a second generation sea urchin diver. My father chased the industry up here from Southern California, and he never left. Initially, when I started diving, the kelp was so thick, you could hardly swim through it. The urchins were all congregated as healthy feed lines. The uni was beautiful and robust. And then after the disaster we've experienced, the kelp beds are gone. We lost about 90% of the kelp along the Northern California coast, and it hasn't rebounded. These healthy areas where I harvested sea urchins for years are decimated and overrun by very small purple sea urchins.
Our urchin populations exploded to more than 10,000% of normal. Back in 2014, we had this event, and they called it the warm water blob. And there was really warm water in the ocean at the time, and this was bad for the kelp. The kelp needs cold water to reproduce, and so we didn't get that cold water. Now, at the same time that happened, we had this disease go through our sea star population called sea star wasting disease. And that was really problematic because one of the main predators of the purple urchin is what's called the sunflower sea star. And those sea stars kind of all but vanished and died within California. That left purple urchins unchecked.
Because the kelp provides habitat for all these other species, when it disappears, that habitat for all those other species disappears and the ecosystem can kind of collapse. Now, why would that matter to someone in Colorado, for example? The overabundance of purple sea urchins is really a symptom of a larger climatic problem. And this climate crisis that we're in is a product of burning of fossil fuels and the production of methane from large-scale agriculture. Thankfully, the ocean absorbs a lot of that CO2. About a third of that CO2 gets absorbed into the ocean. And so if it weren't for the ocean, we'd be in much worse condition than we are now. The impacts of those practices are influencing the kelp forests here.
Kelps, along with other algae, provide over 60% of the breathable oxygen for all life on Earth. And not only that, but kelp forests internationally provide over $500 billion in economic value every year. Kelp forests are super critical to everyone on Earth. We're really lucky in a unique position in California to have two different types of kelp forests we get to work with. So in Southern California, there's this giant kelp, Macrocystis porifera. Up in the North Coast, we have bull kelp, which is this really awesome annual species that provides habitat for so many different types of species.
And so some of the key species that you find in kelp forests that are both ecologically and also economically important on the California coast are things like red abalone, rockfish, crabs, and of course sea urchins. And in some parts of California, like the Monterey Bay area, sea otters are important inhabitants. Without the kelp forest, those species go away, and the economy surrounding those species collapses.
Losing kelp in the way that we have is more than just a habitat or an environmental issue. There's also cultural and ceremonial and food and subsistence and stability that comes from the ocean that the Trinidad Rancheria, also known as the Churay Heights Indian community of Trinidad Rancheria, really depends on. So it isn't just a food resource kind of issue. There's an entire lifeway that has essentially been altered. I think that there is a way to balance economic interests and to allow for indigenous people who have really important ceremonial and cultural dependencies on this area to be the primary decision makers at the table.
The loss of the bull kelp forests has dramatically affected the commercial sea urchin industry here on the North Coast. Our booming commercial sea urchin industry has now been decimated to a handful of divers and just a handful of plant workers. Before this whole disaster, my job as a sea urchin diver was to provide a good food quality product to the consumer. Now that we've been enduring such a great loss of bull kelp, a lot of my work has gone into kelp restoration. And now my job isn't to provide a food product, but to help bring back the healthy kelp ecosystem that everybody and all the different animals need.
What we have out here off the coast of California is millions, if not billions, of urchins, many of which are big enough to harvest and eat. The problem is that they're empty. So what we want to try and do here is come up with a way to economically incentivize the removal of urchins so that the kelp forests have a chance to come back. In a collaboration with commercial urchin divers, they go and catch them and then they hand them off to an aquaculture operator to fatten them up on something else. And then in a matter of weeks, you take something that has no commercial value to something that produces a luxury seafood product that is in high demand all over the world.
So we can bring down the urchin populations back down to what we deem healthy kelp forest ecosystem amount of urchins, and then we should also implement all these understory algae species like Desmarestia to provide those associated defenses for bull kelp.
So in my research, what I'm specifically doing is giving bull kelp this little bodyguard in a way. I'm doing field manipulations where I'm going out into these urchin barrens and planting this specific understory brown algae called Desmarestia ligulata. And what's really cool about it, produces sulfuric acid.
When the urchins graze it, it could actually dissolve their mouth parts. They have these little feeding contraptions called an Aristotle's lantern that's made out of calcium carbonate. And when that reacts with sulfuric acid, it actually can dissolve or pit their mouth. So we're not necessarily coming up with this new restoration tool. We're making observations in nature, like looking at healthy kelp forests and why are they healthy, and trying to use those aspects of that healthiness and bring it into urchin barrens. I think the best way of restoring a kelp forest is trying to emulate what it is naturally and what we remember it to be as.
It's important to have a really strong understanding of the environment to see if there are other potential restoration methods that can work in harmony. It takes a very holistic, systems-based approach that acknowledges the interdependence between people and species and the environment. Collaboration is important because the ocean does not have any jurisdictional boundaries. It's kind of like an ongoing conversation with the ocean.